At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner, however you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. And that's what running's all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
Hey all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods, we will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I'm one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm your other host, Shelby or Shecup.
And we're here to talk about Dragon Age. I remember when we used to open the show and I said, are you ready to talk about some Dragon Age?
Yeah, why did you just stop doing that?
I don't know. It just happened. It just stopped. But are you ready to talk about some Dragon Age?
Yeah, let's do it. Today we're going to talk about a kind of gross topic, one that almost didn't get added to Dragon Age, which is the Darkspawn. So, I mean, when I think about Dragon Age, Darkspawn is one of the several things that I do think are like intrinsic to the world. So it's funny to me that they almost didn't exist, which is going to transition me into the first fun fact. So, in the original conception of Thetis, the lead designer, James Olin, requested that the player needs to fight some kind of like evil horde. And David Gator allegedly was not thrilled with that idea, but he worked to create the Darkspawn as kind of a variant of a Tolkien orc.
Interesting.
So yeah, that's how Darkspawn got added to DAO.
It's really interesting to I want to know what the original conflict was going to be. I wonder if Gator had intended that Orlais be kind of the main antagonist, since they're such an antagonist for the books he wrote.
Or if they had the conception of the old gods and the archdemons, but not their accompanying army.
Oh yeah, could be. I just thought that is really interesting, like you said, something that's this is Thetis, and the Darkspawn entity as a whole shapes so much of the foundation of who Thetis is.
Yeah, because it's this existential crisis that they have to face every so often. So yeah, it's a big deal. So okay, let's get into the rest of my fun facts. So my next fun fact is that crows, the birds, not the assassins, instinctively fear and avoid blighted lands. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting. It's kind of like cockroaches avoid meth labs.
Yeah, good one. So my last fun fact for the day is that there is a classified collection of studies on the Darkspawn called the Blighted Codex, and it is held safely locked away, allegedly, in the Imperial Library in Minrathous, and it's available to be checked out only by members of the Magisterium.
So there are studies on Darkspawn.
I mean, it looks like it, yeah, but we don't really know anything that's in it or anything like that.
Right, which makes sense.
All right, so let's get into some of the general information about Darkspawn. So, if you've played literally any Dragon Age game, you know what a Darkspawn is. They are the humanoid-ish creatures that are tainted by the blight, primarily live underground and amass in hordes during a blight. There are also different types of Darkspawn, which we will get into later in subsequent episodes. But first, I want to get into some lore about how the Darkspawn came to be. And as is the case with pretty much every topic in Thedas, the different institutions throughout the world have different opinions. So today we're going to talk about the Chantry, Tevinter, and Dwarven mythologies surrounding the Darkspawn's creation. If I gave you the choice of like which one you want to talk about first, I know you would pick the Chantry, so let's just jump into that one.
You don't have to put me on blast like that.
I mean, it is kind of my job to put you on blast.
Okay.
Am I wrong?
Sure.
Am I wrong?
I'm not. I plead the fifth.
Okay, so that's a no. Anyway, so according to the Chantry, Darkspawn were created when the Magisters Sidereal of Tevinter attempted to and succeeded in breaching the Fade physically. They reached the Golden City and tainted the realm of the Maker with humanity's corruption. The Maker then sends them back to Thedas, fully corrupted into the first Darkspawn. We've talked about this several times throughout this season because it is intrinsic, again, to this topic. But the Chantry specifically believes that their evil and their hubris is what transformed them into the monsters that we now know as Darkspawn. And then the taint that they carried then infected others, which turned other people into Darkspawn as well. So as numbers increased, groups of Darkspawn then would go underground, digging deeper and deeper into Thedas, until finally, one day, they would find the resting place, the prison of the old god, and the Evanurus dragon thrall, Dumat. Freed from his prison and warped by the Darkspawn taint, Dumat became the first of the archdemons and laid waste to the world through the first blight. And so the Chantry believes that this process basically has just happened over and over again. And it does raise a lot of questions for me, which is primarily if Darkspawn just reproduce by spreading the taint, then have they never encountered the existence of a broodmother? Like, do they not know about that? Is that not common knowledge? Yeah, I don't know. It raises some questions for me. What do you think?
It's hubris and pride that corrupts the Darkspawn in a way of like, it's almost, I think sometimes in Dragon Age we forget the Darkspawn's connection to the Fade in a lot of ways. We forget what's like that they are Fade creatures. In the Darkspawn is the Darkspawn taint and the blight is a Fade essence and a Fade creature. And so I just think it's really interesting, like their hubris, their pride, which is often associated with a demon, is what corrupts them and turns them into Darkspawn, which I actually kind of, that creation versus like the broodmother creation is a little less problematic.
Oh, well, it's a lot less problematic. And we've said this before on the show, like, I don't think we'll ever get answers to what a broodmother is and how all that works, but you know what? We'll just talk about what we do know. So, all right. So do you have any other thoughts about Chantry lore before we get into the others?
Not really, just that I often do find the Chantry lore the most interesting to me, which you put me on blast for earlier anyway. I just like, I've always been fascinated by the Chantry and its very obvious connections to medieval Christianity, specifically Catholicism. And just like, there's a lot of threads in here, like especially this thing of hubris and evil. Like even in Christianity, the first quote unquote first sin is the desire to be God or be like God or know the things that God knows. And so again, we see these themes, and BioWare can say that they didn't
take inspiration, but they totally did.
But they totally, I mean,
it's obvious to me.
It's also just such a cultural thing. Like it would be hard to not take inspiration from.
Yeah, I do agree with you. And I think the thing, I never really cared about Chantry lore really until VEILGUARD, because VEILGUARD for me confirms that like the Chantry is mostly correct. Yes, there are some major things that they got wrong, like their primary worship of the Maker, but most of their other lore and mythologies is very close to being correct. And I think that's so interesting how you could be so wrong and also correct at the same time. So, since this isn't a Chantry episode, let's get into Tevinter. And this will be really short, actually, because Tevinter and the Magisterium, they just basically deny their involvement in starting the Blight. They say, nope, that wasn't us, and the Darkspawn have always existed, and the Magisters have zero connection to them, and that's it.
Again, the fact they're right in that the Darkspawn have always existed. Or not always existed, but they existed pre the first Blight.
Yeah, but they are definitely involved. Don't play us for fools, Tevinter.
I remember, because this information comes from, I think we get this from Dorian. And when he meets Corypheus, he's like, oh, so we're just lying to people.
Pretty much. So I think that's all I have about Tevinter. So I was going to move on to the dwarves, which is very fascinating because, number one, the dwarves typically, as you would expect, just completely eschew Chantry beliefs. But at the same time, they don't have like a robust theology of the Darkspawn themselves, or I guess anthropology of the Darkspawn, at least when it comes to their origin. So what they are more concerned with is the everyday reality of fighting the Darkspawn. They do not really have time or the luxury of theorizing about why the Darkspawn exist. They believe that the Darkspawn just simply appeared one day underground, and that's just all they really care about. There are some shapers, however, that believe a queen broodmother exists who was the first broodmother.
This is so interesting because, like, they're not... I mean, I get it. When you're under in the deep roads, like, you know, you don't really have time or the luxury to think about why the Darkspawn exist. You just need to accept that they exist and they're trying to kill you and you have to kill them. But it's also so interesting to me because of all the races in Thedas, they have the connection to the Darkspawn the most based on the truth.
Yeah, which we'll get into the truth in a minute. But I agree. It is fascinating to me that they just like don't particularly care about the origin of this existential threat that they've been fighting and has decimated their empire for centuries. But I also understand because at its core, Dragon Age dwarves are practical above all else because they have to be. Otherwise, they will literally end. They won't exist anymore. So I get it on some level.
Yeah.
All right. So what is the truth? Insert Oprah meme. So from the VEILGUARD, we know that during the war between the Evanuris and the Titans, Solus used his lyrium dagger to sunder the Titans from their dreams and their spirits, which is why the dwarves cannot dream. And if you haven't played this, you may be at first being like, why? How is this relevant? Just stay with me. The disembodied dreams of the Titans, now locked away inside the Fade, were eventually driven mad by Solus. And he describes these dreams, quote, as a disembodied blight of pain and anger. So this is where the blight comes from. And the Evanuris later begin to weaponize the blight, the angry Titan dreams, during their wars against one another. Mythal and Fen'Harel did not participate. And when Mythal tried to warn the other Evanuris of the danger of using the blight, they murdered her. So in response, Solus imprisoned the Evanuris. What he did not expect, however, was that they would be able to speak through their dragon thralls, who are known as the Old Gods, thus manipulating the Magisters into breaching the Black City. And this is what released a fragment of the Blight into Thedas' waking world. This fragment grew and would later lead to the blights that would sweep across Thedas over the next 1,200 years. So in reality, like we said earlier, the Chantry is the closest to the truth here.
Yeah. I just am always shook when that reality is set in VEILGUARD, and like, this is a fraction of what the total blight is. Like, how devastating is this? You know,
How devastating would it be if it released all of it?
yeah.
Well, I mean, I think we begin to see some of that in VEILGUARD because, and I know people get so upset about like, oh, everything we did in Origins and Inquisition and 2 is just destroyed and ruined because all of those places are destroyed by the Blight anyway. But I think that kind of does show the magnitude of the Blight's power because all of Thedas is destroyed during the VEILGUARD because that's how powerful it is.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, like, people who get upset about Southern Thedas being destroyed by the Blight, one, they're doing that for a clean slate. If they want to continue any games, which go listen to the Mass Effect BioWare layoff reaction to see what I think about future Dragon Age games. But I do think that, like, that happens when big traumatic events happen. Everything else that's going on in that area seems to either take pause or it's a reset almost. Like, and this was a big tragedy in the 1700s, no, 16, somewhere around that, of the Lisbon earthquake, which really reset. Like, the things going on in Lisbon didn't really matter after the earthquake nearly leveled the city. Everyone was just focused on rebuilding the city. And that's only on my mind because of this week's Assassin's Creed episode.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, I think there are a lot of times in BioWare games where it's like obvious, okay, this decision was made for game mechanics. Like yesterday in the Discord, we were talking about how it's funny that you have to choose between Alistair and Loghain. Like, you can't have both of them, even though the more tactical decision would be to have as many Grey Wardens as you can in Origins. But if you had Loghain too, like, there's a potential of having up to 7 warriors in the game, which makes sense. Okay, yeah, like, we can't have that many. That's too much. So, like, that's obviously something that I'm like, this is clearly a combat game mechanic decision. But with this, at least, it feels like both. Like, yes, okay, this is a out of the lore decision that will help us with future games, but also I think it does make sense within the lore. There are a lot of times where it doesn't necessarily make sense, quote unquote, within the lore. But this Southern Thedas, all of Thedas being destroyed, still makes sense to me with regard to the devastation of the Blight.
Right. So here is just a little crackpot theory of things I've seen regarding VEILGUARD. I've seen a lot of people talk about the VEILGUARD in a sense of, like, the decisions that you make don't really matter in the ending game because the ending result is the same. As opposed to Mass Effect 3, where your distinct choice is like, yes, the end result is the same, the Reapers are defeated, but how the Reapers are defeated are something else. And so my question is do you think an option to tear down the veil should have been put into the game? And do you think that it would have been an interesting reset? Because people talk about it being like a true reset, like tearing down the veil. We now have this new Thedas, this new world that has to interact with that.
I think I would be interested to see how fans of Mass Effect reacted to whatever new game is coming out that dealt with the consequences of the choice in Mass Effect 3, synthesis, control, or destroy, before making that decision. You know what I mean? But I mean, I think, for me at least, while yes, you can be a jackass in Dragon Age Origins, you don't have the option to not fight the archdemon, right? You don't have the option to let the archdemon live. So to me, it's kind of like, no, we're not going to let you tear down the veil completely. Like, because it would completely destroy Thedas. It would. It just would. It would reset the world back to a more, quote unquote, historical world, but it wouldn't be good for the people that lived there.
And if the disembodied blight anger of the Titan demons is in there, to get it back to our topic of the episode, like that would then release onto the world.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I think we're ready to go to the mid-break.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
I went to Kirkwall once. Yeah? Bit of a shithole. Yeah.
Well, tell me, have you ever licked a lamppost in winter?
What do you think rooks like in person? Do you think they smell nice?
What is wrong with you? And have you forgotten which side you're on?
No. I mean, think about if we could turn them. Riding beside a rook at the head of Devinter's vast armies. I could stab them for you, on the house.
All right. Hey, welcome to the middle of the show where we take time to say thank you to our patrons. So thank you to all of our patrons. Special thank yous to our first patrons, Genesis and Lisa M. A special thank you to our Nug King patron, Lewis H. If you'd like to join us, you can join us on patreon.com/DALorecast. So reviews, if you leave them, we'll read them. So if you leave us 5 stars and some kind words, we will read them out on a future episode of the show. And so today I have a review from Yama. This says, "Hey, Austin and Shelby, I'm an Afghan fan from Toronto who's recently found this podcast a month ago, and I'm glad I did. I've binged listening to all the episodes. It really helped me get back into Dragon Age universe. The chemistry between you guys is awesome and fun. Also, crazy good observation by Shelby on Varric. This is on our first reactions to VEILGUARD episode. Didn't even think of that. Can't wait for y'all's episodes on the ending. Have a great day." Thank you so much for that review. I am so glad that our chemistry is awesome and fun. That's really encouraging considering we're married. I'm getting the blinking stare from Shelby. Lastly, you can come hang out with us on Discord, the Cubs Podcast Team or Discord. If you want to talk about Dragon Age, this is the place to do it. We hope to see you there. You can find that link in the episode description. And that's really all I got for the middle of the show, so I think we're ready to get back into the lore.
Don't Templars have anything better to do than come up with new ways to torment mages?
No.
Again, I'm so sorry Manfred keeps wandering in while you're asleep, Lucanus.
I think he wonders about spite.
Curiosity has feet.
We have enough feet already.
It has feet.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
All right, so now that we know where the Darkspawn, the Taint, and the Blight all come from, I want to get into some specifics about how the Darkspawn behave and maybe a little bit of discussion at the end of if they have any culture. So, and at first, I know all of you listeners are probably going to be like, no, they don't have any culture. Are you stupid? Just give me a minute. All right, so let's get into physiology first. So really not much is known about their physiology because I guess people just don't get close enough to them to really know. But they are typically described as pale creatures that have black ichor that comes out of their eyes and mouths and is also their blood.
Yeah, I guess people would not make a habit of getting close to
that.
to the Darkspawn. And I guess like you wouldn't want to get close to even a corpse because
of the risk.
Mm-hmm. But my question is like, why haven't the Grey Wardens studied the physiology of Darkspawn?
They may have, and we just don't know about it.
That's true. They do like their secrets.
They love their secrets. Okay, so we also do know a few things, which is that they do not eat food because the taint sustains them. However, they can eat. They just choose not to. Or they don't have food readily available. They also heal faster than normal, which is another effect of the taint. And that's also why they don't typically have healers among their ranks, just because it's not really necessary. Because like if it's a minor wound, it'll heal on its own. But then also they just have the numbers to keep. Like if somebody falls, okay, just bring another one from the back. Like we've got extras. And then the last thing that we do know about their physiology is that they actually have great vision in darkness, where they spend most of their time, which makes sense. And when they are in bright light, they are more challenged visually. So when they're on the surface, their eyesight is a hindrance.
Yeah. Like, I know that being immune to the taint is great, but I feel like the Wardens kind of got shafted on all the special powers.
Yeah, like I think they do get a little bit more healing than normal. I may be making that up, but like that's the only thing.
Yeah.
But at least they still get to eat food.
I know, that's fair.
Like I would not, like I'm so sorry, but if I was just a regular average Thedosian and knew that joining the Grey Wardens meant I didn't ever eat again, absolutely not. Like there's no way.
Yeah, most of what our entire lives revolve around, I mean, food because we need it, but like you and I both, like when we go to new places, we're like, oh, what are all the restaurants we can try?
Well, we're big foodies, so that just makes sense. But yeah. Any other thoughts about Darkspawn physiology before we get into a reproduction?
So if a Darkspawn eats, it's because it wants to?
Pretty much, yeah.
I have lots of questions about the sentience and agency of individual Darkspawn.
Okay, well, we'll get into that later at the end. So let's get into reproduction, which is going to be a not so fun topic. But basically, Darkspawn are not sexual beings. Great, thank you for that information. They don't reproduce as we think of it. Instead, broodmothers are what provide the Darkspawn population, and this is lore that comes from Origins and really has not been touched on since, for obvious reasons, which we'll get into. Broodmothers are created by force-feeding captured female prisoners the taint and Darkspawn flesh. And those that survive this, they become broodmothers whose only purpose is then creating more Darkspawn. The notable thing about a broodmother is that each species of Darkspawn is created by a different broodmother. So broodmothers who were once human produce Herlocks. Broodmothers who were once dwarven produce Genlocks. Broodmothers who were once elven produce Shrieks. And broodmothers who were once Qunari produce Ogres. So that's how they reproduce, not as the Chantry claimed that the Magisters just spread the taint to everybody.
Yeah, which is interesting, but also to a point of, like, you talked about this earlier last week or whatever, but Ogres were on Thedas before Qunari were.
Before Qunari were on the mainland, yes. And it is an interest. I don't know if I would call it an oversight or if it's intentional. But like the theory or whatever is that, and I think this is in the lore, that there were a colony of Kossith that landed in the Korkari wilds in far southern Ferelden many years ago. I don't even know, like the early ages, like the 200s, 300s eras, if not earlier than that. And so they landed in the Korkari wilds, and the the Darkspawn captured or used a broodmother from this colony to start producing ogres. So it's entirely possible that ogres, as we knew or as they knew them in like the third blight, are completely different from ogres as they know them in the fifth blight.
It is very, very possible. And like ogres are a lot bigger, I feel like, in VEILGUARD than in the other Dragon Age games.
I don't know if I think that's true.
Oh, maybe it's just how the game is set up and they look that way. But yeah, that's really interesting. And like there's always like before a main invading force lands, there's always like there's like a group that discovers this land first.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're like the Vikings quote unquote discovered England or whatever because one ship landed. And I think about in the inheritance cycle when they're talking about humans and they're telling Aragon the history of humans, he's like, wait, I thought we arrived much like earlier than that, like several hundred years before you're telling me we arrived. And like, oh, if you count one ship of 200 warriors as the arrival of humans, yeah, but we count like your actual arrival and settlement of this land as your arrival.
Yeah, I mean, it is a big question. But let's get into hierarchy because this is something I find interesting. So Darkspawn, especially the young, they fight amongst themselves in order to weed out the weak. Alphas, Darkspawn alphas, which are kind of like the leaders, they're more difficult enemies to fight in the games. They come into existence when a Darkspawn is so strong that they weed out their entire brood, or the ones they're born with. They're generally taller, stronger, and more intelligent than the rest of their kind, leading them to take leadership positions. An alpha that manages to slay another alpha is known as an omega, and only one of these has ever been seen. You can experience it in Wynn's side quest in Origins.
Yeah, I think they forgot about that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think they kind of forgot about alphas and omegas just in general.
Yeah. Yeah, alphas were just, I mean, you do see them in Inquisition, and they're just stronger versions of the enemy.
So emissaries are another form of Darkspawn leadership, but they're not necessarily like higher than alphas or omegas. They're just kind of on a parallel plane. They're just different. And emissaries have the ability to cast magic, and they draw on the power of the taint to do so. They act more as like spiritual leaders rather than militaristic leaders. So you could kind of think of an emissary as a magical priest, religious whatever leader, whereas an alpha is like a general commander.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting the way the Darkspawn use magic because it is kind of like a form of blood magic, especially since they're drawing on the taint.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes it really interesting with the lore of if, you know, that the Blight is the disembodied dreams of the Titans and the Titans are so connected to lyrium, it's like the Blight itself is just corrupted lyrium in a sense. Like, so like they can draw upon the taint because it is lyrium, basically.
Yeah, my brain is not working enough to like have an intelligent conversation about that.
That's okay. We'll let the commenters comment on me.
Yes, please let us know what you think. So only the Archdemon can control the entire horde, whereas alphas act as commanders and omegas act as second in command to the Archdemon. And the strongest of these will receive direct orders from the Archdemon. And when there isn't a blight, this chain of command breaks down almost completely, with individual alphas and omegas assuming leadership positions of their own mini hordes, thus splitting up the Darkspawn population and fighting for dominance among each other.
I just think it's really interesting that, like, okay, this archdemon comes and unites them all, and then, you know, you kill the archdemon, and it's like, let's just kill everything.
I mean, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. In the Lord of the Rings game, the Shadow of War, you can do this. Like, if you take down like the lead orc, all the other orcs start fighting each other, and like they're so corrupted and so power hungry that once a power vacuum happens, that they don't care about anything else they were doing or even their own survival. They're just striving for that power vacuum.
And I don't necessarily think the Darkspawn are striving for a power vacuum. I think that they are not, without the oversight of the Archdemon, I don't think they have like the minds to continue warfare and battles.
But it's really interesting because I remember when you talk to the Legion of the Dead commander in the Descent, his name is escaping me, but when you talk to him, he talks about the Darkspawn as if they like have intelligence and can move and plan military strikes and are like any other enemy you would fight and track movements of.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into communication and culture a little bit, which I think we're going to have more discussion on these. So starting with communication. Most people in Thedas barely consider the Darkspawn sapient. Like, they possess very little intelligence beyond just simplistic animalistic urges. However, at the same time, they are capable of coordinated action, especially when an archdemon is present. But they seem to show little fear, and though they will retreat if they begin to lose a fight without an archdemon guiding them, they will never surrender to their foes, and they will continue fighting even if countless other Darkspawn have been slain. They do not possess any language beyond hissing, grunting, and the like. However, they do communicate with one another, and they have been heard laughing during attacks, as well as taunting or threatening their opponents. Despite their general lack of a spoken language, they do communicate via a hive mind. The more intelligent ones, like alphas and emissaries, are capable of learning speech, as we know from Dragon Age Awakening. So that's everything about their language and capabilities for speaking.
I think this is really interesting, especially the last point here about the alphas and emissaries capable of learning speech and other things like that. Because I think it's really, really interesting when you compare it to Manfred's story in Dragon Age, the VEILGUARD, because he starts out, with his hissing and other general noises, and then, spoiler alert, gets to a point of having like very broken speech. And even later in there is able to wield magic, which implies that Manfred dreams.
Yeah.
And so this is a really interesting point to me of like, I think the Darkspawn in this point are very interesting to me, and to the architect's point, like, given the opportunity, would they develop into a culture? But like, they're so violent in the beginning that they're not given that opportunity. So there's no way to really there's no safe way without the architect's plan of making everyone Darkspawn to give them the opportunity. But a lot of this implies that given eventually like a course of evolution would lead them to develop culture, to develop, speech and other things like that.
Okay, well, I think you make a good point. So let's just get into our topic on their culture. So most people would say they don't have a culture. They don't do anything that you need to do to create and have a culture. Like, they don't have a written or a spoken language. They don't build homes, etc. However, I have 2 points here. They do possess an ability to create, primarily armor and weapons. But it does exist. This crafting ability is crude, but it does exist. They also create primitive forts and defensive areas within the deep roads. And Herlocks are even known to tattoo themselves, primarily to keep track of their kills. But I think the biggest argument in favor of Darkspawn having culture is that they do worship the archdemons.
Mm-hmm. The ability to create has always been like a benchmark of like sentience, especially among the Chantry, because that's why the Maker is, according to their lore, the Maker is disappointed with the first children, with the spirits, because they have no creative forces of their own. They only mimic. And like here, the Darkspawn, you could say they are mimicking the other cultures around them, but like they are creating stuff, and like their structures and their forts and defensive things are unlike any other culture in Thedas. Like they don't build them the same as the humans do, or the elves do, or the dwarves do. And you think they would be very dwarven, just because that's the culture they interact with the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. But I also think, like, you know, just comparing it to our world, if we take away the grossness of the Darkspawn and just like think about them as like another creature, is this really that different from early humanity who lived in caves and didn't really build homes, and, you know, they drew on the walls and fought anybody that came near?
Mm-hmm.
Is it really that different from Neanderthals and early humanity?
No, I mean, look at beavers. Beavers might not be able to talk to us. Beavers do communicate with one another, and like most animals can communicate with other creatures around the thing. They just don't communicate via speech.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can teach most primates sign language, and they will communicate and use it.
Yeah.
Like, so that evidence is there, but beavers build dams. They build and create their own homes. Birds build nests. Like, this theme is across all of creation. So like,
and I do think part of that is just like survivalistic tendencies. Like, you have to have a shelter, right? Like shelter, food, and water are the things you need to continue living. But I mean, I think that creating like defensive fortresses and weapons, that goes beyond simple survival.
Right. And they do this whether an archdemon is there or not. So it's not just the archdemon giving them guidance.
Correct. Yeah.
It's really interesting to me because this worship of the archdemons, because you go into the deep roads, and even when you do the return to Ostagar, there are a bunch of indications that they're building shrines and altars to these archdemons, and like even like monuments to their victories.
Yep. Yeah, and like if you remember in that DLC, there's an emissary that taunts you and like drags you into fighting them and ambushes you.
Right.
Like that's not an unintelligent creature.
I don't disagree with that. I think it is interesting, and that the architect does have a point. I know we're not going to talk about the architect much in this, but like I think he has an interesting point that could Darkspawn be built into a culture? I just don't think there's really a way to find that out without ushering in the destruction of Thedas.
Yeah, fair.
And like, it's not quite the same, but it gets to the point of like, you know, the Geth, does this unit have a soul? Is not the question itself proof that you might?
So what I'm hearing is the Geth are to Mass Effect what Darkspawn are to Dragon Age.
No, I would say more the Reapers fill that
No,
role,
I don't agree. I definitely think it's Geth, and then like Reapers would be more equivalent to like the archdemons or even the Ebenuris.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's way off sidetrack. So unless you have any other comments about the Darkspawn, I want to get into our side character.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so today's side character is an obscure, deep cut, yet a personal favorite for me. If you have read The Stolen Throne, you will recognize the name Nauther of House Canarek, leader of a regiment of the Legion of the Dead. So Nauther appears in this book. He plays a major role. Merrick and his company first encounter Nauther when they are traveling through the deep roads from Ortantig to Guarin. Basically, Nauther saves their asses from a group of Darkspawn, and afterwards Merrick persuades him to offer them aid. And not only that, but he also gets them to lead a unit of the Legion of the Dead to the surface to help fight against the Orlesian occupation. Nauther, in return, extracts a promise from Merrick that he will commend their actions in Orzammar, and that he will return every single dead dwarf to be buried within the stone. They go on to fight with the rebels during the Second Battle of Guarin and at the Battle of the River Dane, where Ferelden is finally liberated. Sadly, though, Nauther and his entire company perish in the battle. King Merrick does keep his promise, though, and he visits Orzammar, praising the efforts of Nauther and Legion of Dead the Legion of the Dead to King Iduken. You can actually find 2 entries in future games that reference Nauther and his actions, both from DAI. So in the DAI Codex Dwarven Mugs, Pride of Nauther, it says, the words "let them eat steak" are etched into the side of this well-worn tankard. And then in DAI Armor, during the Descent DLC, you can find a rare heavy armor named Nauther's Armor in the Legionnaire camp.
Yeah, Nauther is just like another point of like, I remember early in that book, Loghain is like, I hate this kid, but goddamn, he is so likable.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of Merrick's like real strengths, is that he is, it's beyond charming. Like, he is endearing. Like, he is endearing to the people around him. He like, when you interact with him in Stolen Throne in particular, I think he's a little changed and different by the time that the calling happens, but Rowan has died since then. He has his own existential crisis. But like, early young Merrick is so endearing. It's such a person that you look and you interact and you're like, I want you to win because you are so almost pure. You're so pure that I want you to succeed and be okay. And I think Nauther looks at that and just be like, oh my God, how did you get into these deep roads? Like,
yeah, I do think Nauther is like, how did you survive up to this point? And if I don't help you, you're not going to.
Right.
But I also think, going back to your point with Merrick, like, who doesn't want the underdog to win?
Right.
You know, like, who doesn't want Luke Skywalker to defeat the Empire? Like, of course you do. That's the whole point. And if you don't, I can't relate to you. I'm sorry. So of course we want this young kid to defeat the Orlesian Empire, who's controlled his entire country for the last however many years. Like, of course.
Right. And I think that Merrick does have that like indescribable quality of like a leader's ability to inspire loyalty. And I think that this dwarf, who by all accounts of Orzammar doesn't exist,
is already dead. Yeah.
Feels the need that like, yeah, I'll help you.
But I also think, you know, and I know this isn't Merrick as a side character, it is Nauther's story, but Merrick could have easily just said, you know what, I'm not going to make this trip to Orzammar. They all died anyway. Nobody would have ever known. But he went there and he fulfilled his promise to Nauther. And I do think that's significant.
Yeah. And like, Merrick has a lot of his fault, mainly his
elf coochie habit.
Yeah. But his honor of like keeping promises he makes to people is not really one of them.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, just to kind of wrap it up a little bit, I do love Nauther. If you haven't read The Stolen Throne, it's a pretty good book, and you'll get more of Nauther in it. He's a pretty likable dwarf, and yeah, he's one of my faves.
Yeah, I like him too. Everyone loves a good sassy dwarf who's just done with the humans around him.
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't really say he's sassy, but more exasperated is probably the word I'd use.
Yeah, that's a better word. You're right.
All right, well, let's wrap it up.
All right. Thank you so much for this episode and doing all of the research. Thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. But before we go, thank you to our Nug King patron, Lewis H. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/Dragon Age Lorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Ever wanted to be a content creator but had no clue where to begin? Come join me as I sit down with content creators that have already faced the challenges you're up against, as they discuss the tips and tricks that help them be successful. Here on The Content Creator's Guide, available wherever podcasts can be found.